David Grann's runaway bestseller, Killers of the Flower Moon, tells the forgotten story of America's Osage Indians, whose astounding plight in the 1920s was not born of poverty, but of riches, because underneath their reservation was an ocean of oil.
They were considered the wealthiest people per capita then in the world. So it said at the time, whereas one American might own a car, each Osage owned 11 of them.
Their wealth made the Osage attractive targets for cold-blooded con men, who sometimes even married their victims, took their money, and then their lives.
These murder schemes were essentially inheritance schemes, and it's one of the things that made these crimes so deeply sinister.
Grann's taut and shocking book is now becoming a major motion picture, with an all-star cast and director.
My hope is with a movie, a book reaches so many people, but a movie can reach even more. That this story will become part of our national narrative, will become part of our consciousness and part of our conscience, which is where it belongs.
How Grann found the story, how the murders created the FBI, and how racism and greed led to one of the most disgraceful chapters in American history, as we meet the reporter who uncovered it all. David Grann, welcome to St. Louis.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You know, the book is fascinating. The amount of research that must have gone into it is sort of mind-boggling, really. It was about 5 years, right?
Yeah, it took 5 years. I didn't realize when I began how long it would take, but it was quite a journey. And part of it was archival, trying to find records to bring this story to life. And then the other part of the research was tracking down descendants of both the murderers and the victims who had suffered from this criminal conspiracy and getting their oral histories and what documents they had.
It's not just putting together a jigsaw puzzle. You have to go out and find the pieces to put into the puzzle.
100%. And I'm a big believer that, you kind of have to do that work. And, I would spend weeks at various archives, and for days and days, you kind of find nothing. And then one day, almost through serendipity, you open a folder, and there is the secret grand jury testimony from one of the trials that had never been made public and wasn't even properly filed. And it suddenly cracks open this world, and you hear the voices of the people you're writing about.
Well, and really speaking of serendipity, it's a little bit how this started. You had some knowledge of it when you went down to Oklahoma to kind of poke around a little bit, but it really started with a photograph, and not even so much the photograph, but what wasn't in the photograph anymore.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I was fairly ignorant of these crimes and what had transpired, and I made this trip out to Osage territory, the Osage Nation, and the first thing I did was I went to the Osage Nation Museum to see if I could learn more. And when I was there, I saw this great photograph. It was taken in 1924. It shows members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers. Looks very innocent from afar, but I noticed that a portion of that photograph was missing, and I asked the then museum director, Catherine Redwood, I said, well, why is that part of the photograph not there? And she said it had contained a figure so frightening she had decided to remove it, and she pointed to that missing panel, and she said the devil was standing right there. And she then went down into the basement, and she brought up an image of the missing panel, which they had, and it showed one of the killers of the Osage. And for me, that, it's rare that books or stories have kind of origin stories that are so clear, but for me, this really was the origins of the project, because I kept looking at that photograph and thinking, the Osage had removed it because they couldn't forget what had happened, and people like me had never been taught this. We had never learned it. We knew nothing about it, and I just thought, how can that be? And so that really began this kind of quest. It was about a 5-year quest to try to figure out who that missing figure was, the history that figure embodied, and it led me to what I would come to realize was one of the most sinister crimes in American history.
Yeah, pure evil.
Pure evil.
And the guy we were speaking of, Mr. Hale, when you look at him, he looks like an accountant or something.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's so unsettling. about these crimes is that, these were prominent figures. William Hale was a deputy sheriff. He was a cattle baron. He was somebody who advocated for what he called God-fearing souls. And yet here he was engineering several of these murders. But as the project went along, the story also changed, because originally I had thought of this story about this singular evil figure, which was Hale. And he really is a fairly sociopathic creature. And yet, over time, as I spoke to more Osage, as I found more documents, as I collected more oral histories, I began to realize that this was not actually a story about a singular evil figure. It was really about a culture of killing, about many people who were involved. And you had bankers and lawmen and sheriffs and prosecutors who were complicit. You had doctors who were administering poisons. You had reporters who did not disclose the truth. And you had many others who remained complicit in their silence. And so what's most unsettling, or for me at least, what was most unsettling, is we like to think that when people commit these crimes, there is this kind of singular evil figure who is somehow apart from us and different from us. And when you remove that evil, everything returns to normal. But what if ordinary people committed these evil, and what lurked inside them? And the only explanation after all the years that at least got to that is that the Osage were killed for their money. So greed was the primary motivating factor, or a motivating factor. But that was fueled with this prejudice in which the Osage were not seen as these fully embodied humans with, dignity and with the same souls. And those two forces, that greed and that prejudice, came together to create this culture of killing.
It was a runaway bestseller, I guess still is. So for the 5 people who haven't read it,
yeah.
Let's lay out the story a little bit. So
Sure.
We're talking about the Osage Indians.
Yep.
At this time, they were mostly in Oklahoma.
Yep.
They had sort of gotten pushed down there
Yep.
because it was terrible land, and the people who pushed them down there had a surprise under the land.
Yeah, it turned out that this land where they had, this kind of pile of rocks, as one Osage chief called it back then, turned out to be sitting upon some of the largest deposits of oil then in the United States. And there were only about 2,000 or so Osage on the tribal roll at that point because of forced migration, disease, massacres. I mean, the Osage had been forced to cede more than 100 million acres of their territory. They once had a presence here in Missouri. They stretched all the way to the edge of the Rockies. Thomas Jefferson had referred to them as this great nation. And then, of course, as it happened to so many Native Americans, through this drive to take over their lands and massacres, their numbers had dwindled. But they ended up ultimately in the 1870s on this area was then Indian Territory. It would later become Oklahoma, and it turned out it was sitting upon all this oil. And so those 2,000 or so Osage received, for example, in the year 1923, the equivalent of what would be today about $400 million. They were considered the wealthiest people per capita then in the world, and reporters, often with a great deal of prejudice and sensationalism, would head out to Osage territory and kind of regale their readers with these stories about the quote-unquote plutocratic Osage and the quote-unquote red millionaires with their terracotta mansions and their cars. It was said at the time, whereas one American might own a car, each Osage owned 11 of them.
Well, were they truly that profligate, or was it all just, I hate to use the term fake news, but...
Yeah, there was a great deal of, the Osage were like any other human beings. You had some who were profligate, you had some who saved their money, you had some who invested. The specter of human nature, it was no different for the Osage as it was for, I think, any humankind. But what was different about the Osage was there was this great deal of prejudice, both in the coverage and then also in terms of what politicians ultimately decided to do. So they portrayed them as these children who somehow couldn't, again, it was part of this prejudice in which somehow the Osage, couldn't handle their money. And it went so far that members of the U.S. Congress passed this legislation requiring that many Osage have these white guardians, these businessmen, these bankers, these politicians, to manage their fortunes. And this system was not abstractly racist, it was literally racist. It was based on the quantum of Osage blood. So if you were a full-blooded Osage, you were deemed quote-unquote incompetent, and you were given one of these guardians. And not only was it a racist system, it also led to one of the largest state and federally sanctioned criminal enterprises, as many of these guardians went on to swindle, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from the Osage.
Well, and it's not only is it outrageous, but I don't even see how it was legal.
Yeah, well,
except that Congress passed it.
Yeah, Congress passed it, and I really recommend. For me, it was eye-opening to go back and dig up the debates that these members of Congress would have. And you really get a sense, we're not talking that long ago, you're talking about the 1920s, you really get a level and the breadth of prejudice that existed at that time.
So these guardians, it sounds like, were really at the heart of this remarkable conspiracy,
yes,
which you found, again, sort of by accident, serendipity, looking at the lists of some of the people they represented and noticed how many were dead.
Yes, yeah. So I went to one of the main archives I visited was in Fort Worth, which is a branch of the National Archives. And it's this enormous warehouse. Looks like something out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they, stick the Last Covenant at the end. It's just huge. It could fit airplanes in it.
Like the furniture area at IKEA?
Yeah, just enormous. And I had pulled records on the Guardians, and I was hoping simply to determine whether a certain Osage had a certain guardian. And so I pulled all these records. I was going through the boxes, and in those boxes was this ledger. It was a little book, had like a fabric cover, that identified guardians and who were the Osages whose fortunes they had managed. And it was only for a few years. And when I opened up the book, I noticed that one of the guardians had had 5 Osages whose fortune they had managed. And the only other thing in this book, besides the guardian and the Osage whose fortunes they controlled, the only other writing in the book was if one of the Osages had died, somebody, some anonymous bureaucrat, had written the word next to the name. It just said the word dead. And so I noticed under one of these guardians who had had 5 Osage, I noticed next to one of the names the word dead. And then I looked at the next name and I saw the word dead. And I looked at the next name and I saw the word dead. And then I looked at the 4th name and it said dead. And I looked at the 5th name, all 5 dead. And I thought, that's crazy. That defies any natural death rate. This is just a few years. The Osage were wealthy. They had health care. They were not hungry. And so I began to look at other names. And I noticed under one name there was about, there was one guardian who had about a dozen Osages whose fortune they had managed. And about 50% were listed as dead. Now again, some of these may have been from natural causes, but it defied any natural death rate. And so then I began to try to investigate and look into some of those names that were listed. And in several of the cases, I could find testimony of money that had been stolen, or a complaint about a poisoning, or of a suspicious death, or some bit of testimony. And by the end, I came to realize that this little seemingly antiseptic ledger really contained the hints of a systematic murder campaign. And to me, also the person and the bureaucrat who had written the word dead next to each name, it really struck me as this kind of banality of evil, this kind of bureaucratic evil. And it got to also the breadth of complicity, because that person had to have known as well. I mean, why are all these people having their names listed as dead?
So why were these guardians, those that participated in this conspiracy and others who weren't guardians, killing them? Because they couldn't get the money through some sort of inheritance, because it was a headright. They could only be passed through the family. Is that correct?
So when the Osage, before they became a state, Oklahoma became a state, the U.S. government forced upon the Osage this kind of culmination of this very brutal assimilation campaign, which was allotment. And what they wanted to do was to divvy up the land, and each Osage would have a portion, and then they would open up the rest of the lands. And this was a way, not incidentally, to make it much easier to procure Native American lands. And this had happened in many other First Nations. But when the Osage were negotiating, they had more leverage. One, they had a deed to their land. They had actually purchased it, so they had this deed. They were the last nation in what was then Indian territory to be allotted. They were led by one of their greatest chiefs at the time. This guy spoke like 7 languages, French, Sioux, and Latin. And they inserted into their treaty provision, into their treaty over allotment, what seemed at the time a very curious provision. It said, "We shall maintain all the subsurface mineral rights to our land." And at that time, nobody knew that the Osage were sitting on a fortune of oil, but they knew there was a trickle, and they very shrewdly managed to hold on to this last realm of their territory, a realm they could not even see. And each one of those Osage who were on the tribal roll were given a headright, which was essentially a share in this mineral trust. And a headright could not be bought or sold. It could only be passed down through inheritance. And so these murder schemes were essentially inheritance schemes. And it's one of the things that made these crimes so deeply sinister. They involved these intimate levels of betrayal. They involved people marrying into families, usually white men, but sometimes white women as well, marrying into families, having sometimes children with an Osage, while systematically plotting to murder them, and sometimes their children as well, so that they could then inherit those headrights.
There is a dispute as to how many people actually died. The official number is what, something like 24?
Yeah, I think the official total from the FBI listed was usually about 27.
But you suspect it's much, much higher.
Much higher. And when you begin to look, for example, at the books like that ledger, you begin to realize that there was this kind of much deeper and darker conspiracy that the FBI in its investigation never fully exposed, and that this really was about a culture of killing, and there were many people complicit. When you speak to Osage, when you look at the archival records, a conservative estimate would be in the scores, if not hundreds, of people Osage who were killed.
The FBI is sort of the parallel story going on here. This really gave birth to the FBI, or at least nurtured it. I mean, the FBI wasn't called the FBI then,
It's
but
called
it was
the Bureau of Investigation.
Right,
yes.
right. And J. Edgar Hoover rose to prominence. Of all the people you would think would not be interested in helping these poor Indians out in Oklahoma would be J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, so the Bureau at that time was a pretty ragtag operation. They had only a smattering of offices across the country. They suffered from many of the same problems that plagued law enforcement at that time, which was poor professionalization, great deal of corruption, poor training. And FBI, which was then known as the Bureau of Investigation, suffered from these two. And the FBI had very limited jurisdiction over crimes at that time in the United States. But one of the jurisdictions they had was over American Indian reservations. And so that is why this case fell to the FBI and why it became one of their first major homicide cases. And it fell to Hoover. The Bureau had actually been working on the case starting in 1923, and for 2 years they worked on the case, and they completely bungled it. They failed to make any arrests. They got this informant, this guy named Blackie Thompson, who was this kind of legendary outlaw at the time. They got him out of jail thinking, okay, we can use him as an informant to help us, and instead he slipped away and he robbed the bank and he killed the police officer. Just before that, Hoover wanted to dump the case because he didn't think they could solve it, and he just was afraid of the headaches. But he was suddenly afraid that the scandal might destroy his dreams of building this bureaucratic empire. He was only 29 at the time. He was new to the job, and he was afraid that the scandal might end it. So that is why he took over the case, and he eventually turned it over to a frontier lawman, an old FBI agent, a guy named Tom White, who takes over the case or leads the investigation.
Yeah, White as this character. If it was fiction, people would say you were sort of telegraphing something there,
true.
maybe.
It's true. It's true.
So it really did kind of give birth to the FBI, right?
Well, it was really one of their first major homicide cases, and what it did was it helped build the manner both of its power as a federal agency, where it would have broader jurisdiction, but also the beginning of kind of the professionalization of investigations. And this was a real stepping stone toward that. They used fingerprinting, they used handwriting analysis, they used undercover operatives to try to crack the case. And so it became a kind of case study or model in the development of the Bureau.
Well, and they needed all of that technology, at least technology of the time, because these murders were kind of all over the map. Some were shootings, some were poisonings. It wasn't just one kind of, basic conspiracy. It was crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy. And I write a lot about this remarkable woman named Molly Burkhart, this Osage woman who was born in a wigwam in the 1880s, practicing Osage traditions, speaking Osage. Because of the oil money, within a few decades, she's living in this kind of large terracotta house. She's married a white settler. And she really is somebody who straddles not only 2 centuries, but 2 civilizations. And her family is being systematically targeted, and it shows the various methods used. I mean, her older sister, Anna Brown, is first shot in the back of the head. Within 2 months, her mother has died of suspected poisoning. And then she had a younger sister who was so terrified of these killings, she had moved to live closer to Molly. And one night, Molly hears this loud explosion. She goes to the window. She looks out the window, and in the distance, she can see this orange ball rising in the sky, and somebody had blown up her younger sister's house. So just in that one family, you have a shooting, a bombing, and a poisoning. And not only were the Osage being systematically targeted, but even those who were not corrupted, who had tried to catch the killers, were often killed. You had one man thrown off a speeding train. You had a man who went to Washington, D.C. to try to get federal authorities to look into these killings. He went into a boarding house. He received a telegram from an associate in Oklahoma that said, "Be careful." He left the boarding house that night. He was abducted. And his body was found in a culvert the next day, and he had been stabbed more than 20 times and beaten to death.
Again, for the 5 people who haven't read the book, I don't want to spoil the ending. So we won't go into if justice was meted out, although I think you can probably guess for the most part that the story kind of goes in that direction. But it's your belief, I think, from the research that you came up with that makes up the 3rd section of the book,
yes,
that there's a lot more out there that could be uncovered.
Yes, and one of the things in speaking to so many Osage, getting their oral histories and getting documents, is you begin to realize that there are a lot of other suspicious deaths that were never properly investigated, and that the case was effectively closed prematurely. And one of the great challenges is, and I'd always thought in reporting and telling stories like this that you can't bring justice, but you can at least provide a proper accounting, which is to say you can identify the perpetrators and record the voices of the victims. But in many cases, that's no longer possible. Suspects are deceased, the witnesses are deceased, and this was a conspiracy in which people, were consciously covering up evidence. You had morticians covering up bullet wounds, doctors covering up the crimes, you had lawmen covering it up. And so in many of these cases, you can't provide that proper accounting. And for me, that was one of the most haunting parts, is that in many cases, the murderers had not only erased the lives of their victims, but they had also erased their history. And many Osage to this day live with gnawing doubts, not knowing precisely who is responsible for the death in the family and the absconding with their money.
Reading the book, I think anybody reading the book would say, this could make a really good movie. Including, I guess, Martin Scorsese, eh?
And we talked about that photograph a little bit. And for me, the hope in writing the book was hopefully to address my own ignorance, but also to hopefully fill in some of the ignorance of people outside the Osage Nation. The Osage obviously know their history deeply. And my hope is with a movie, a book reaches so many people, but a movie can reach even more. That this story will become part of our national narrative, will become part of our consciousness and part of our conscience, which is where it belonged.
What do you hope the takeaway is for people who either read the book or see the movie?
It's too late to bring justice. We're talking, you can't bring justice. You can't bring people back to life. But my hope is that we can at least restore some of our history so that we can know more about our past. And in knowing more about our past, also think about the kind of people we want to be and the kind of nation we want to be in the future. And I hope that'll be the takeaway as people move forward.
Maybe some good can come of it.
One hopes.
David Grann, thanks very much for visiting with us. Appreciate it.